Ever heard of an old school game called Mario Bros. 2? And no, not Super Mario Bros. 2, I mean Mario Bros. 2 for Commodore 64. Even if you're pretty knowledgeable with retro titles, chances are you still haven't. And I don't blame you, I myself only found out about this game by sheer accident. It's mentioned very vaguely in the Mario franchise's Wikipedia page under a list of Mario's in-game appearances. This one specifically being a port of Mario Bros. On Game & Watch. And so, one night out of boredom, I downloaded a ROM rip from an unsecured site that wasn't even in English and popped it into my emulator. But what I found when I did was so incredibly hilarious that I can't help but show it to you. And no, in case you're curious, this game did not come on a floppy disk. I put it on one myself for the sake of having a physical copy to hold up. But I do have a floppy disk drive, so I technically can still play it off of here. Funnily enough. When the game starts, you're greeted with this title screen, showing a character who only vaguely resembles Mario. It was 1987, and you can argue that Mario's appearance wasn't extremely well established yet, but this was after Super Mario Bros. On the NES was already out. And just look at the front of Mario Bros. On the Game & Watch. The game that Mario Bros. 2 is a sequel to. They look normal there. Anyway, the game starts and it gives you a few seconds to prep and get ready, and as the title suggests, you need 2 joysticks when playing this on a Commodore. Now, since this is a Commodore 64 ROM, I'm using an emulator, and setting up this game was oddly challenging. Because it requires 2 joysticks, I've set up player 1 as my keyboard's arrow keys, and player 2 as my Xbox 360 controller. Sounds easy enough, but getting these both to work at once barely happens, and I have no idea why. When I finally did get them both to work, this screen appeared, which is the entirety of the game. Games consisting of one screen were quite common, especially for arcade games, so this is hardly a complaint. When playing, you control both Mario and Luigi on opposite sides of a conveyor belt. The goal is to catch cakes that come out of this chute, and move them from one level to another on the assembly line. They'll become more and more complete with each pass before eventually being sent to a delivery truck. Every time Mario or Luigi moves up a cake, you earn 10 points. Every time a cake is past the truck, you earn 1 point for the van score. Drop 3 cakes and the game is over. But this is where the controls get a little bit tedious. Like I said, you control both Mario and Luigi, and if you've ever had to play on a real Commodore, you'd barely be able to hold the controllers properly. Some sources list this as a 2-player game, but that's honestly debatable. The original wasn't, and this was made as a port after all. Plus, you'd think if it was intended as a 2-player game, then Mario or Luigi would rack up points separately. On the Game & Watch version, it makes a little bit more sense. You have an up and down button on each side, and you can hold it like an NES controller and use both hands. But here, when playing this game as intended, you're forced to hold 2 bulky controllers because this game isn't simplistic enough to work with one. There have been some single-player retro games that use both controllers, like Raiders of the Lost Ark on Atari, but with that game, one controlled the character and the other performed actions. You didn't have to hold them both at the same time for the whole game. And yes, I know the Commodore had a keyboard, so there's a chance this game didn't control like this originally, but the menu itself does specifically say joysticks. So I'm just gonna assume it was programmed with this method in mind. You might have noticed, however, that on this emulator there's a center button. It's activated by pressing any other button on the keyboard aside from the arrow keys, or any of the buttons on the Xbox controller besides the D-pad. On Commodore, this would most likely translate to the button off to the side. When used in-game, this pulls up a strange pause menu of sorts. In it, there are options to activate cheats, but what's more noteworthy is the block of text reading, "Frostbitten I became forthwith to see crystallized dimensions to where the unfaithful fly. You may say I'm demonized, but yet I'm not the only one. You must come to me. There are nocturnal paths to follow. Painted faces from earlier centuries wander the desecrating winds. Binded shadows cast out from daylight and from the beaten lands." Now what the hell does that mean? Well, doing a reverse word search reveals that these are actually the lyrics to a song called Grim and Frostbitten Kingdoms by a band called Immortal. So basically, it means absolutely nothing. Why is this here? In fact, on the main menu, there's a long line of nonsensical text at the bottom that also doesn't make much... What the f***? So as you probably guessed by now, this game was not licensed by Nintendo. And in fact, its release status is a bit strange. According to the game itself, Mario Bros. 2 was developed by The Riffs and Thundersoft. And searching them up online reveals that The Riffs is actually a Dutch demo group that would meet up at the Oosterhout Computer Club, with Thundersoft being a subgroup. Apparently, Mario Bros. 2 was made only as a means of showcasing this group's ability to port a pre-existing game. And sources about the game conflict as to whether or not it even got an official release. According to GameBase 64, the game was never released publicly, but on GameFAQs it's listed as having been released in Europe in 1987. But an article archived from RetroGamer.net states that, is it a commercial game, or is it a homebrew game? The only sources to the game say it is a commercial game, but there's no mention of it anywhere else. So how'd it get circulated? The wiki page certainly doesn't provide an explanation. Well, from what I can determine based on the remaining information in the menus of this game, 1615 and Corpse Grinder are referring to 2 members of World Funeral Productions, which is a subgroup of another demo group called Tankard. Apparently, this is a community special specializing in ripping Commodore ROMs and adapting them to be playable on emulators. In the list of their games, Mario Bros. 2 is included, displaying the menu with the aforementioned song lyrics, which they apparently added themselves, and this fits when taking into account the way the group describes itself. The game was actually ripped in 2008 and seemingly independent of Thundersoft. It was then uploaded to C64games.d, and through a slow trickle of uploads online, the game saw its way to an unofficial release. It's unknown how Tankard got the original ROM file, but a title preceding the game states that it was imported by Microman, who's also a user on the same site and credited as having a hand in making Mario Bros. 2. I know almost nothing about this kind of stuff, but from what it looks like, Microman made the game available to Tankard, who then made it playable through emulation. Maybe he'd gotten it from someone on the original dev team since this was never officially released prior, but even still, very little is known about this game's development, and it remains an obscure yet interesting piece of gaming history. Oh, and also the game f***ing sucks.